I'm Robert Hanna. I'm an interpreter with the Lewis and Clark Fort Mandan Foundation in Washburn, North Dakota. Our event is the Capital and Farm Country Tour of downtown Bismarck, North Dakota. The theme of the tour is that it takes a couple hundred years to figure out how to thrive off of agriculture in North Dakota. The Hidatsas and the Mandans were the first farmers in North Dakota. They've been doing it for maybe about 500 years, probably more. And they'd be farming along the Missouri River Valley here. Back when Ben Franklin was a young man and he moved to New York City back in 1723, granted he had no way of knowing this, more people lived in those 9 villages right here than in New York City. Yeah, and they were living off of farming. It takes time to figure out how to build a successful farming economy in North Dakota, and it will always be a bit of a struggle because even though we have fabulous soil, our weather is just awful. I don't know how else to put it. The growing season is short. It does rain sometimes. You don't know. It's very unpredictable around here. It's part of our location in North America. It's always a struggle. When the pioneers arrived in North Dakota, it didn't take too long to realize that the corn and the other crops that they were bringing with from other parts of the United States or crops they brought with from Europe just could not survive in our climate in North Dakota. You know, normal corn growing in, let's say, Illinois or Iowa in the 1800s took about 110 days to mature. The Hidatsa and the Mandan women over here had figured out corn that could mature in about 90 days. So pioneers immediately turned to their expertise and specifically to their crops. And when you traveled around early North Dakota, a lot of the corn people were growing was stuff that they had acquired from those tribes. By the way, the reason we're standing in here today is because this is the oldest building standing in Bismarck. This was built in 1872. This is a log cabin. I don't know if any of the logs are actually sticking out, but this is made out of just good old cottonwood logs cut in the river bottom. And then they've, over time, added the nice plaster and the clapboard out there and the tin ceiling to sort of dress it up. But this is the oldest building in Bismarck, and I will explain why it was built outside. But we need to go out here to the railroad tracks, because the story of modern Bismarck starts over there. You always hear about the Transcontinental Railroad as if there were just one, but they actually built 4 of them all together in the United States, and this one was the second. This is sort of like the Northwest Passage. You know, these explorers for hundreds of years were trying to find the easy water route from the Atlantic to the Pacific to make easy trade, and it just didn't exist. You know, that's what Lewis and Clark were trying to finally find out, and they finally determined, like, nope, there's just no such thing. There's never going to be a Northwest Passage. So they had to build it. And they figured the way they were going to build it is they would create this Northern Pacific Railroad, sort of a business that they were going to set up, a little bit like the Postal Service, but then they were going to spin it off as an independent business. So the Northern Pacific Railroad practically created modern North Dakota, and I'm not sure if anybody realized what kind of problems that could lead to. Basically, everybody was completely dependent on the railroad. The railroad moved them out here, the railroad gave them their transportation to and from here. Everything they bought had to be shipped to them on the railroad, and everything they sold, like their wheat and other farm products, had to be shipped out by the railroad. So people were very heavily dependent on the railroad, and using just a few corrupt politicians, a few leaders, and some business insiders in the railroad, they were able to have a large amount of control over the lives of people in North Dakota or Dakota Territory. So this was like the nexus, the connecting point of Bismarck and the railroad. This would have probably symbolized to people how powerful the railroad was in people's everyday lives. And a former railroad employee by the name of Alexander McKenzie, you may know his name from the McKenzie building over here. Alexander McKenzie was a buddy between the railroad and the politicians in Dakota Territory and kind of ran the state from behind the scenes. At the time, and by the way, when I'm talking about politics, please bear in mind that the politicians of these time periods have nothing to do with the politicians today. So I'm not trying to say anything about any political parties. It was the case at that time that most North Dakotans voted for Republicans because that was the party of the Homestead Act and Lincoln and bringing immigrants to the West and all this stuff. So people generally voted Republican, and basically Alexander McKenzie would pick the Republican candidates. And so whoever he wanted got elected. Alexander McKenzie was such a big figure in the history of the West that there's actually a John Wayne movie about him called The Spoilers. This has to do with his time in Alaska. Alexander McKenzie, during his many absences from North Dakota, went up to Alaska during the gold rush up there in the 1890s and started stealing people's mining claims. He got arrested, he landed in jail, and he was ultimately bailed out of jail by President McKinley. Well, he came back quietly to Bismarck, and nobody in Bismarck had heard about this. This was a long time before, you know, the internet and so forth. But eventually, a guy by the name of Rex Beach published a book. The book was called The Spoilers, detailing all these stories, and so people in Bismarck began to realize what he'd been up to, and a lot of people were not too surprised. Oh, why was this called Bloody Fourth? You know, back in Custer's time, this was kind of all saloons and bars. You know, Bismarck was one of those proper Wild West boom towns, you know, and it sounds like about half the businesses or more were saloons, and apparently the other half were brothels. So it was a pretty rough time, and some of like Custer's guys got shot in one of the bars down here. 2 or 3 main people to talk about on this tour. One of them is this guy. His name is Oscar Will. So far I've been talking about some of these kind of political solutions to Bismarck's problems. This guy had, if you ask me, the real solutions to Bismarck problems. Basically, he was a man far ahead of his time. Oscar Will and the Oscar Will Seed Company always promoted the idea that you got to grow more than hard red spring wheat in North Dakota. There's quotes from them over and over again saying that that just means certain disaster for North Dakota farmers if they don't diversify and start growing other crops. I'll pass this around for you to look at if you want to, but this is a Mandan Indian corn variety that may have been bred and grown here since the 1500s. This is some of the oldest food ever eaten in North Dakota. It's a little plant, grows about yay tall, makes excellent flour or toasted corn nuts, as a matter of fact, which the Indians used to make. And so Oscar Will realized we should be selling stuff like that. We already know it grows in our climate. And so this location was where he had his seed store, which looked about like this. He had another neat thing. Oscar Will would also sell a lot of garden plants for people to grow in their, gardens. And he liked to do watermelons. He had his own kinds of watermelons that he bred. But it was always, and it has always been tricky for seed companies to separate out the watermelon seeds. So he would just set a bunch of barrels out here, and he'd invite all the kids of Bismarck to come and have as many free watermelons as they wanted to, as long as they spit the seeds into the barrels. And he'd bring out one kind of watermelon at a time, right? So he'd bring out the Will Sugar watermelon barrel, label it on the side, kids would spit out all the seeds, and boom, there's free labor, sorting out seeds for him. Really bright guy. And so they were interested in good crops wherever they could find it. Hidatsa crops, Mandan crops, crops from other tribes in the United States, crops from Russia, crops from Europe, anything that could thrive in North Dakota's climate. They were bringing it over here and encouraging people to diversify and try growing this wide spectrum of different things. If you look at farming in North Dakota today, we do grow a lot of hard red spring wheat, but we have really diversified, and they had that original idea way back in the 1880s before most people started practicing it. I want to show you a couple of Oscar Will's catalog covers right here. This is from 1917. This is actually the year that Oscar passed away. But they decided that year to put a picture of Oscar with his name underneath, right next to a picture of a lady named Scattered Corn. Those of you who have been to Honest Land Village know her as the lady who helped them rebuild the earth lodges up there. She was also an expert in the old traditions of farming here in the Mandan tribe. And so the caption underneath it says, Dakota's first seed specialist. That really shows Oscar's attitude. Now his son George Will took over the company, and he has some very nice catalogs. These are considered pretty collectible nowadays, these like historic style catalog covers. And this is very much in the style of that time. I don't know who the artist was, but they're pretty slick looking.
Yeah, the artwork's awesome.
Yeah. But some of it, in hindsight, is maybe they were trying to honor American Indian history, but I think today we'd say, well, that might not have been their best effort. But okay, what happens is Clell Gannon, who actually worked in this building, This was the Provident Life Insurance Company. Clell Gannon was a longtime friend of George Will, Oscar's son, and George asked Clell to start painting the catalog covers. And Clell really understands these Hidatsa and Mandan cultures and does these very nice, maybe not quite as slick, but very accurate portrayals of how this traditional farming was done. And so, late every winter, North Dakotans got reminded of a different aspect of their farming history here in North Dakota. Yeah, so it's interesting. You see politics and you see diversifying our economy. That's like the two main threads here. And the politics, they try all these dramatic things, but it doesn't seem to make that much of a difference. But when they start farming new things and then adding other aspects to our economy, like coal in the 60s and things like that, that is what seemed to really kind of shore up our economy in North Dakota and help us out.